Greetings and welcome to NAFSA's first Education Abroad Government Connection. A couple of reminders for the audience. If you hover over the top of your screen, you should see a drop-down menu that includes a chat bubble. Please click on the chat icon if you would like to submit a question. We also received a good number of questions in advance, and we will answer as many of those as we have time for at the end. NAFSA is pleased to connect you with the U.S. government officials today who will review some of the regulatory changes with regard to Cuba and their impact on your work creating and expanding education abroad opportunities in Cuba. In 2015, NAFSA launched the Cuba Engagement Initiative. The initiative consists of two interrelated projects. The first is the U.S.-Cuba Higher Education Dialogue, which is intended to provide practical information and resources to help connect U.S. and Cuban higher education institutions. And second is the Educators for Cuba advocacy campaign to lift remaining trade and travel restrictions imposed by Congress. The Cuba Engagement Initiative builds on NAFSA's long-standing focus on Latin America and Cuba and redoubles NAFSA's commitment to the use of academic exchanges and partnerships to build a more globally engaged United States and develop new opportunities for U.S. and Cuban international higher education leaders to collaborate. Visit nafsa.org/Cuba Engagement to learn more about the Cuba Engagement Initiative and check back for upcoming events specific to education abroad in Cuba. I'd like to highlight the connection between policy and practice and the clear impact that federal regulations can have on our field. If you look at the chart shown here, you can see a precipitous drop in the number of U.S. students studying in Cuba when new restrictions on academic travel to Cuba were introduced in 2004 by the previous administration. Between 2004 and 2011, the number of U.S. students studying in Cuba remained very low. In 2011, President Obama announced an easing of restrictions on academic travel to Cuba, resulting in a rise in U.S. students studying in Cuba. The connection between policy and practice is quite apparent when you see this information, and we believe with the help of education abroad professionals, this number will continue to rise. There is a saying, the Cuba you know today isn't the same Cuba as yesterday or tomorrow. Things are changing every day. Some changes are slow and long-awaited, and others are swift. This is a professional practice area where knowledge is being built through experience, and NAFSA has created an online discussion space for you to share questions and best practices as the situation continues to evolve. The Cuba Engagement Network. Many of you may already be familiar with the Education Abroad Knowledge Community Network at networks.nafsa.org. These NAFSA networks function as listservs and spaces for conversation. To stay in touch with your peers about the latest news, events, and information on education abroad in Cuba, please subscribe to NAFSA's Cuba Engagement Network today. You can subscribe by visiting network.nafsa.org, or you can also find information about subscribing on NAFSA's Cuba Engagement Initiative page linked on your screen. My name is Allison Cash-Spiro, and I am the Associate Director for Education Abroad Outreach and Regulatory Practice at NAFSA. I work with NAFSA's Education Abroad Regulatory Practice Committee. For today's presentation, we have Stephen First as our moderator. Steve is a member of NAFSA's Board of Directors, serving as the Vice President for Public Policy and Practice, and his full-time role is the Executive Director of the Center for International Service at CUNY, Staten Island. Steve will moderate the discussion today. Today's featured speakers are Katie Ford. Katie is joining us from the Office of Foreign Assets Control with the U.S. Department of the Treasury, where she serves as a Senior Sanctions Policy Advisor. Samantha Rollinger-Soltoon. Samantha joins us from the Office of Foreign Assets Control with the U.S. Department of the Treasury, where she serves as a Senior Sanctions Policy Advisor. Andrea Corey is joining us from the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs with the U.S. Department of State, where she is a Policy and Coordination Officer. And Madalena Young-Smith joins us from the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Madalena is a Public Diplomacy Officer in the Office of the Coordinator for Cuban Affairs. Thank you all for agreeing to speak today. One more thing before I pass it over to Steve. We created a supporting document for this event found on the same web page as today's Government Connection. In that document, you will find links to many sources of information on regulations and education abroad programs in Cuba. Links to the Treasury Department, the State Department, and the White House, among others. Be sure to view the document after the Government Connection today. Steve, I'll pass it to you now.
Thank you, Allison. So I just want to go over a few of the things that we're going to talk about today, and very quickly before I pass it on to our presenters, the topics we'll be covering a general versus a specific license for operating programs and traveling to Cuba, travel authorizations for going to Cuba and how you can return, educational activities and opportunities, trade and commerce that's allowable, and grants and awards as they relate to working with Cuban institutions. So that's kind of the outline of it, and then we're also going to be using some acronyms today. As you know, we're all in favor of shortening what we say. So for the acronyms, I want you to take a look at the screen that we have up for a moment. OFAC, that you heard earlier, is the Office of Foreign Assets Control. SOE, State-Owned Enterprise. CACR, Cuban Assets Control Regulations. ECA is Educational and Cultural Affairs. WHA, Western Hemisphere Affairs, and GL is General License as opposed to SL, which would be a specific license. I have asked our presenters for the first few moments to try to use the full words, and then I'm sure everybody will slide back into our acronym soon enough. So if you just take a look at that screen, kind of take a mental image of it, and we're going to move ourselves on to our public policy.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Madalena Young-Smith. I am with the U.S. Department of State. Thank you very much to NAFSA for hosting this very timely forum. I'd like to take a few moments just to discuss our policy change from isolation to engagement and give you a quick timeline of how that has changed. Since 2009, President Obama has made a number of regulatory changes intended to strengthen people-to-people relations. After over 50 years of isolation, President Obama made a historic announcement on December 17, 2014, that changed the course of our relationship with Cuba. The President's vision for Cuba policy trades isolation for engagement once again and enables us to more effectively represent U.S. interests and values and reach out to the Cuban people. While our policy approach has changed, our goal remains the same: the emergence of a peaceful, prosperous, and democratic Cuba. Our respective negotiating teams following that historic announcement met on several occasions in both Havana and Washington, D.C., and a series of serious and respectful bilateral meetings to discuss an agreement to reestablish diplomatic relations. Separately, we continue dialogues on issues like migration, the environment, human rights, health, and trafficking in persons. President Obama announced on July 1, 2015, that diplomatic relations would be reestablished and our embassy reopened effective July 20, 2015. A couple short months later, or 1 month later, on August 14, 2015, Secretary of State Kerry traveled to Havana for the ceremonial reopening of our embassy and to raise the U.S. flag once again. In a nutshell, the new policy is forward-looking. While it recognizes and improves our ability to support the struggles and sacrifices of the Cuban people and our ability to carry out commitments to improving human rights, it also emphasizes the value of people-to-people connections and increased ties through trade, communication, and respectful dialogue. We are now on a road to normalize relations with challenges and opportunities ahead. The reestablishment of diplomatic relations was an early step in the process. Normalization will be a longer, more complicated process that will require continued engagement and dialogue between our two governments based on mutual respect. As for strengthening those people-to-people ties, promoting the free flow of information to, from, and within Cuba, and building stronger people-to-people ties, including through academic and cultural exchanges, have been key components of this administration's policy toward Cuba for years. The President's policy direction supports more interaction between our peoples, and as the President has said, and I'm sure you
we seem to be experiencing a slight technical glitch. Just hold on a moment. We will try and get our speaker back.
Pardon me, Madalena is back. I'd like to fast forward to strengthening people-to-people ties, promoting the free flow of information to, from, and within Cuba, and building the stronger people-to-people ties, including through academic and cultural exchanges, have been key components to this administration's policy toward Cuba for years. The President's policy direction supports more interaction between our peoples, and as the President has said, our citizens are our best ambassadors. As you will hear soon, the amendments to Cuba sanctions regulations support increased interaction between the U.S. and Cuban people. Purposeful travel to Cuba by U.S. citizens is on the rise and fuels powerful connections among families, religious communities, scholars, and young people. I'd like to fast forward to the more recent historic trip by President Obama and his historic announcement. It was a visit by President Obama to Havana, and it was the first by a sitting U.S. president since President Coolidge. President Obama's most recent trips to both Cuba and Argentina not only demonstrate our commitment to education and youth in these countries, but to the entire region. While in Havana, the President emphasized the importance of strengthening people-to-people relations once again, and he also underscored the importance of education with the announcement of a new $1 million commitment from the Cuban American community to the 100,000 Strong in the Americas Innovation Fund to create university partnerships that will enhance regional cooperation and provide new study abroad opportunities. As a quick point of background, President Obama launched the 100,000 Strong in the Americas initiative to promote increased international educational exchanges between the United States, Latin America, the Caribbean, and most recently Canada. The goal is 100,000 exchanges annually in each direction by 2020. This new $1 million fund in innovation grant monies will support Cuba-specific innovation fund grant competitions in 2016 and beyond to increase bidirectional student mobility between Cuba and the United States in fields such as entrepreneurship, agricultural management, business and social innovation, environmental and sustainable energy, language learning, international trade and development, study abroad infrastructure, and cultural collaboration. We are excited about the 3 existing 100,000 Strong grants between U.S. and Cuban institutions. We look forward to continued partnerships in the education sector and working directly with Cuban academic cultural institutions on other standard education and cultural exchange programs. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pass it off to our next speaker, Katie, who is going to take us through some of the general license and specific license issues.
Yes, hi, I'm Katie Ford. I'm from the Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, and I work in the Policy Division, and I'm actually here with Samantha Saltoon as well. We work very closely together. We've been working very hard over the past year and a half on the regulatory amendments. In mid-March, we issued our 5th round of regulatory amendments to the Cuba sanctions program, which is pretty incredible considering that we often don't change certain sets of regulations for years at a time. These amendments ease certain sanctions consistent with the President's new policy towards Cuba and build on regulatory changes issued across the administration over the past 15 months. I would like to briefly discuss a few changes from our most recent amendments to the Cuban Assets Control Regulations, or CACR, that's what we call it, Cuban Assets Control Regulations, as well as some others that are significant for this community that we've made since January 2015. I'd also like to flag that in addition to the regulations themselves, we've issued 4 sets of fact sheets, dozens of FAQs. I think we're up to almost 100, thanks to Samantha over here. And all of those materials can be found online at our website, and we've made a very easy URL. It's treasury.gov/Cuba. So if you have any questions, write that down. There's so much information on there. As far as the general and specific licenses go, it's really important to understand the difference between the two. Some people call general licenses exceptions, but we see general licenses as something that the general public can take advantage of without coming to OFAC for authorization. A specific license is something where you come to OFAC, you apply, you say, I have this issue, and then we will issue a specific license just for your activity. So if you don't find that your activities fit within the scope of a general license, which are found in the CACR, the Cuban Assets Control Regulations, then you can write into OFAC for specific authorization. On to the next slide, which is travel authorizations. In January 2015, we eased the travel restrictions by issuing new and expanded general licenses in the 12 categories of authorized travel. So in the Cuba program, there's 12 categories that are that have been codified in statute. So what we've done within all of those 12 categories is open them up and created new general licenses within them. Prior to the January 2015 changes, we only had 3 general licenses in them, and otherwise people would have to apply to OFAC. But now we've broadly expanded them. And with every round of regulatory changes, we've made some openings there. The subsequent regulatory amendments authorized facilitated travel to Cuba, and they mean that they extend to faculty, staff, and students at U.S. academic institutions and secondary schools to engage in certain educational activities in Cuba, and also authorize Cuban scholars to engage in educational activities in the United States, and certain activities that facilitate licensed educational programs. In the travel authorizations, I will just direct you to a particular section. I think this is really important for you all to write down. It's 515-565. It's a section in the CACR that really describes in detail what educational activities are authorized. And there's several categories under there. There's different paragraphs, and then there's categories of what's authorized. And so if you are wondering whether your activities are authorized, you need to find in the regulations where you're authorized, so you can be sure that what you're doing is both authorized and that you're allowed to travel to Cuba. There's also another one that's called the professional meetings category, and we expanded this general license to authorize people to travel to Cuba to organize professional meetings and conferences in Cuba, provided that such meetings are not for the purpose of promoting tourism in Cuba. And so this is important. The professional meetings and general license is rather expansive because it must relate to your profession or area of expertise. But for many people in this community, you would be traveling for that area. So those are 2 important ones to keep in mind. Similarly, under the public performances, clinics, workshops, and athletic and other competitions category, we now allow by general license travel related to organizing these events in Cuba. We also removed requirements that U.S. profits from these events be donated to certain organizations, and that certain events are run, at least by part, by U.S. travelers. So it was previously more restrictive, and we opened it up further. So that's another one to take a look at: public performances, clinics, workshops, athletic, and other competitions. Next slide. For educational activities, over the past 15 months, OFAC has expanded the general license for educational activities. Some of those key changes include authorizing the provision of standardized testing services and internet-based courses, and authorizing academic exchanges and joint non-commercial academic research with universities or academic institutions in Cuba. OFAC also authorized travel-related transactions associated with these activities. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague from the State Department to discuss the scholarship program.
Great. My name is Andrea Corey from the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, and it is a pleasure for me to be here and to be able to speak with you all about some of the exciting opportunities that we are currently in the midst of. And it's important to note that although student exchanges between our countries are not new, they are happening now in a new context with new opportunities. So for our part, the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, we will be looking for ways to increase the participation of Cubans in State Department exchange programs, and also facilitating U.S. participation in exchange programs in Cuba. And this includes exchanges in the arts and sports, growing the 100,000 Strong in the Americas education initiative to include Cubans, and also helping increase language capacity, English language capacity in Cuba. And this new approach to Cuba directly supports more interaction between our peoples, and as the President has said, and Madalena also quoted, our citizens are our best ambassadors. So again, in ECA, we look forward to working together with you all as well, all of the NAFSA members, to foster and facilitate more innovative partnerships with Cuba. We are committed to continuing to think creatively about how to best encourage and support increased people-to-people ties as well. And there also, during President Obama's historic trip to Cuba, there were lots of great exchange opportunities that came out. For the first time, Cuba will be included as a participating country in the Cuba H. Humphrey Fellowship Program, and this brings about 200 outstanding mid-career professionals from developing countries to the United States for non-degree study and related professional experiences. So you all please be on the lookout for some of these participants on your campuses. And also the Benjamin A. Gilman International Scholarship Program. And this is an opportunity that offers grants for U.S. undergraduates of limited financial means to pursue academic studies or internships abroad. Another thing that we are working on is through our Education USA services. We are improving access to university admission, standardized testing, and in so doing, the first TOEFL exams were offered in Cuba last summer, and additional opportunities will be implemented in the coming months. One other point that I want to briefly touch on is that if there is interest in applying for some of the USG programs, I encourage you to look on our exchanges.state.gov website. And one of the things that our Assistant Secretary for Education and Cultural Affairs, Evan Ryan, has said is that, although our programs at ECA are famous, they are not the only means of studying and traveling to Cuba. There are a number of organizations with established roots in Cuba, and we really encourage you all to find linkages with those organizations through our Office of Private Sector Exchange Programs, and this is something you can review on j1visa.state.gov. There are also opportunities for organizations to serve as sponsors of J-1 visas. Last year, we had a number of Cuban participants to travel to the U.S. on a number of different categories, and there are different ways to leverage the program. So I encourage you to look at those opportunities. Also, the Sister Cities International program. This is also a program that has a long history in Cuba, and it offers a lot of opportunities that academics and others can pursue that are non-governmental, but really that have proven to be effective in Cuba. Thank you.
Hi, this is Madalena Young-Smith once again. I just wanted to quickly touch on some efforts by the U.S. government, the State Department more specifically, on ways we have tried to promote more bi-directional exchange with respect to Cuba. The Department of State has hosted a number of symposia and other fora, which I think maybe some of you have attended or participated in. And these symposia and fora have intended to convene interested education community representatives and practitioners, and to also connect them with many of the existing universities who already have long-standing exchange programs in Cuba. Just a few examples of these symposia that we've hosted, and we hope that the archived footage that lives on the World Wide Web offers an additional resource to you as you plan your way forward, is the Building Bridges Symposium we held in September of 2015 in conjunction with George Washington University and Sister Cities International. Secondly, we also hosted a Google Plus Hangout on educational exchange opportunities in Cuba that featured our public affairs officer team in Havana, along with our Education USA program officer. And most recently, the U.S. Embassy in Havana supported a symposium organized by the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, HACU, that brought together university presidents, deans, practitioners, and government officials from the United States, Cuba, and a number of other Latin American countries to exchange information and ideas on how to collectively work together to better support and expand partnerships throughout the Western Hemisphere. This new policy of engagement, as talked about earlier, has opened up some doors to begin rebuilding relationships and trust, especially in the university communities. Our public affairs officer in Havana has been afforded some opportunities to travel outside of Havana to cities throughout Cuba to begin forging those relationships ahead. And just a few points of advice as you move forward in trying to establish a study abroad or exchange partnership in Cuba is that coordination is critical to moving forward any type of program in Cuba. My first suggestion is to reach out to universities that have existing partnerships, as Andrea mentioned before, with Cuban universities and institutions to get a better sense of the process and steps necessary to move forward. My second point of advice is to reach out to the Cuban Embassy in Washington to walk through any ideas and to seek any interest in moving forward. And thirdly is to, and I think most importantly, is to make sure that you develop those relationships organically and, as we've heard from our Cuban government interlocutors, to engage slowly. Last point, and this is once your program is kicked off and running and you have students actually in Cuba, we urge you to advise them to register at travel.state.gov. Thank you so much for your time.
So we're going to continue on with our next point in the presentation, and Samantha is going to join us.
Hi. So to move on to trade and commerce, there are also a few relevant changes related to trade and commerce that may be relevant to this audience. The first is that OFAC expanded the existing authorization for physical presence in Cuba. Physical presence in OFAC sort of layman terminology would be an office, retail outlet, or warehouse. And this authorization was expanded to include entities that engage in authorized humanitarian projects, entities that engage in certain non-commercial activities that provide support for the Cuban people, and private foundations or research or educational institutes. For example, with an established interest in international relations to collect information related to Cuba for non-commercial purposes. We had previously authorized entities organizing or conducting certain educational activities to establish a physical presence in Cuba. OFAC has also authorized the importation of Cuban origin software in addition to Cuban origin mobile applications. Go to the next slide. And finally, on to grants and awards. Most recently in March, OFAC added a new provision to allow educational grants, scholarships, and awards to Cuba and Cuban nationals, which means Cuban state-owned entities, could be a Cuban government institution, etc., as long as they would qualify as educational grants, scholarships, or awards. And there's some more specific details on this on our website. And also we added a clarification that grants and awards for certain authorized humanitarian projects are permitted. These steps will further enable Americans to support educational projects in Cuba and to participate in philanthropic efforts, which will in turn help improve the living standards and economic opportunity for the Cuban people. Next slide. In terms of what has not changed, so the embargo on Cuba, despite all these changes, is still very, very much in place. It is in place as a result of congressional statutes. And those statutes also dictate that travel to Cuba for tourist activities remains prohibited, and it's still illegal. So if you have questions regarding whether or not your travel is authorized, we urge you to look on OFAC's website. Katie gave the URL earlier on. Please ensure that your travel to Cuba falls under one of the 12 categories of authorized travel. There aren't any exceptions to that rule unless you get a specific license from OFAC. Next slide.
Great, thank you. As we mentioned earlier, the Cuban engagement initiatives that NAFSA has put in consisted of two interrelated projects. This kind of virtual forum that we've been doing so far has been part one. It's known as the U.S.-Cuba Higher Education Dialogue, which helps to link U.S. and Cuban academic institutions together. The second part is our advocacy work. And that is known as our Educators for Cuba campaign, and we're advocating here to lift the remaining trade and travel restrictions that exist. For more info on that, we suggest that you go to www.connectingourworld.org, and you can get involved there with NAFSA's advocacy efforts. I hope that all of you actually are already members there. I'll give you that URL again. It's www.connectingourworld.org. So we're going to turn it over to our question period now, and I'm going to moderate questions as they come in. We've already gotten a few, which we're going to take. I will read the questions, and then our government experts here will give us some answers. The first question concerns the OFAC FAQs. The OFAC FAQs indicate that an authorized traveler's schedule of activities must not include, quote, free time in excess of that consistent with a full-time schedule, unquote. Can you clarify what that means in practice? And I'm going to ask Samantha to tackle that.
Sure. So there is no specific percentage that would dictate exactly what you can and cannot do. There are really specific examples on our website in the form of FAQs that lay out what a full-time schedule of activities would look like. And I would strongly urge you to look at those examples. There's also very specific examples in our regulations regarding what would and would not qualify, for example, for individual people-to-people travel as a full-time schedule of activities. So it would really depend on the nature of which travel general license you're traveling to Cuba under, and what the specific requirements are. For all authorized travelers to Cuba, I just would remind you that you have to save your receipts for 5 years following your travel in case OFAC does have any questions regarding the activities you've engaged in.
Great, thank you. I have another question here about Cuban students studying in the U.S. Do we know how many undergraduate Cuban students are currently studying in the U.S. and where they might be studying?
So a great resource I'm sure you all are very familiar with is IIE's Open Doors report. And so according to the last report, 94 students from Cuba studied in the United States between 2014 and 2015. And they studied at various colleges and universities. I do not have the full list, but if you log on to IIE's website and get a copy of the report, you can see the distribution.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question to that first question. Though travelers in the people-to-people category are no longer required to participate in structured group tours operated by an entity under U.S. jurisdiction, if a person still chooses to go to Cuba as part of a group program, whose responsibility is the record-keeping requirement? Is it the group's responsibility or the individual's?
So it's largely the groups if you travel as part of a group, but we would encourage you, if you have any questions regarding any of your travel-related transactions, to maintain your records again for 5 years. If you do travel under people-to-people, or what OFAC calls P2P, travel as part of a group, though the group is also responsible for maintaining records, including a copy of that itinerary.
Terrific. I'm going to ask another technical question here. I think it's going to be another OFAC question. Can U.S. entities freely purchase or rent space in Cuba to operate educational programs? What are the limitations there on leasing and or buying space, if at all possible? And does this need to be authorized by the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security? Another acronym, we use BIS for that.
So a simple way to think about where OFAC draws the lines and BIS draws the lines is BIS authorizes the stuff going to Cuba, the goods, the items, etc. For example, an entrepreneurial hairdresser needs to get, expert scissors and items for doing haircuts. The stuff would be authorized by BIS, and the transactions to get the money to and from Cuba, those would be authorized by OFAC. So when you're trying to contemplate new business endeavors in Cuba, that's a good way to divide where you would need authorizations and who to ask which questions of. In terms of leasing space, there's a specific OFAC general license, or GL. It's 515.573, and it's actually titled Physical Presence and Business Presence in Cuba Authorized.
and it explains exactly what types of physical presences are authorized, what you can do while you're there, including the operation of bank accounts for certain transactions, including the hiring of Cuban nationals, marketing related to the physical presence, and employment of U.S. persons who are subject to U.S. jurisdiction that you would bring down to Cuba, provided you have the right authorizations from the Cubans. So there's a number of details included in that authorization that I would suggest you review when you're considering whether or not to go down there. Among, as I mentioned, the entities that are authorized to establish a physical presence would include entities organizing or conducting educational activities that are authorized by the general license that Katie had referenced earlier, 565A. So a number of you on the phone would probably fall under that specific authorization.
Great, thank you. This is a question more for visa consideration. Since Cuba has been opened up for education abroad programs, what have been or are there any issues and visa considerations that we need to be aware of?
First of all, this is Andrea, and I'll tackle that as best I can. It's just important to keep in mind that all students, in Cuba that are applying to travel to the U.S. for an academic program, they have to obtain a visa, and it is up to the student to overcome the burden of immigrant intent and to be able to prove that they are a legitimate student. So if a student is able to overcome that burden, then certainly they are able to come in and to apply and secure their visas.
Great, thank you. We're going to take another question here about traveling from a third country. And the question is, can you please clarify that authorized U.S. travelers may travel to Cuba from a third country, or do they need specific OFAC authorization?
So as long as your travel to Cuba falls within the 12 categories of authorized travel, the ones that we kind of keep drilling home on from an OFAC perspective, you can go via a third country. In fact, that's how the cruise ship that left today and arrived in Havana today, those travelers could stop in multiple locations, provided all of their travel to Cuba falls under one of those 12 categories of authorized travel.
Excellent. Another study abroad question. Do all study abroad programs in Cuba have to be vetted through a university, through the University of Havana specifically, or can we set up programs with other Cuban universities?
Madalena, do you want to take that question?
Sure. So the vetting question is a good one. It's quite unclear as to what exact processes are in place for universities interested in establishing partnerships, and that's another reason why we urge you to link up with universities who already have those partnerships. I would say that the first suggested route of discussing your plans for study abroad opportunities in Cuba is to engage the Cuban Embassy in Washington, D.C. Thereafter, I think that you would have the room to reach out to folks on the ground, be it in Havana or another city, to start those conversations.
Great, thank you. Another question's come in, and we are combining some of these questions, so if you don't hear your question, hopefully it's being folded into another here. Given prohibited tourist activities, or the activities that are prohibited, can travelers take personal time before or after their business-related trips?
No.
Simple answer. That's a pretty easy one. How about this question here about students and staff booking airline travel directly with the airlines, or do they need to go through an authorized OFAC agency?
Absolutely not. In fact, as a result of our regulatory amendments issued in January and the bidding process the Department of Transportation is currently reviewing from U.S. airlines, commercial flights to Cuba should be open as early as this fall. That may be optimistic, but I think it's as early as this fall, and once that happens, individual travelers can book their tickets directly with a commercial carrier. Currently, you can book them directly with a charter carrier. Again, you'll have to provide a certification of which of the 12 categories you're traveling under, and you'll need to save your receipts.
Perfect. I think that's an important thing we keep going over that you will need to save those receipts. It's important that you keep record keeping of everything you'll be doing. Speaking of record keeping, when planning a program that doesn't require a university of record in Cuba, what visa or regulatory paperwork might be needed to complete to ensure that we are compliant? So you want to take a stab at that one. So again, that question is when you are not working with the University of Record in Cuba, what paperwork might be needed to ensure compliance?
So from the OFAC side, if you're engaging in an authorized educational activity, which would mean it would fall under 515.565, which is that general license Katie listed earlier on, it has a wide array of the types of educational activities that you can participate in Cuba. If you are participating in one of those, then it would be the same needing to maintain your records for 5 years and ensuring that you fulfill all of the requirements, i.e. a full-time schedule of appropriate activities, etc. From OFAC side, as long as your travel falls wholly within that authorization, you don't need anything else from us. If you're unsure if it does, or if you're looking to do something that would fall outside of that authorization, then you would need an OFAC-specific license.
And in terms of traveling to Cuba, the only thing that I would add is that it would be important for you prior to travel to look on the Cuban Embassy's website to make sure that you have all of the necessary visa requirements met.
Terrific. There's an interesting question specific to tourism management. Can academic programs in tourism management engage in Cuba given that tourism is still prohibited?
So tourism is prohibited, and professional meetings or research that are authorized as long as it's not for the purpose of promoting tourism in Cuba. So I think it would be a fine line. You would need to ensure that your training or academic engagement in Cuba would not in any way promote tourism in Cuba. If it's sort of official training and academic training that otherwise meets the terms of the general license, then it would otherwise be authorized.
Okay, a couple of questions on banking here. I'm going to combine them into one. Who or where should I check for the banking regulations and policies between the U.S. and Cuba, which is also getting combined with some information earlier that we spoke about bank accounts, so we're going to expand a bit on how that might happen from what we know to date.
So we've issued a number of changes that relate to banking in Cuba. For example, authorized travelers to Cuba can open up a bank account. Businesses that are authorized to establish a physical presence in Cuba, such as the ones I listed off earlier, are also authorized to open up a bank account and to close such bank accounts and transfer the money back to the U.S. if needed. So there's a number of authorizations. I would like to say that the regulations are very friendly and easy to read, but I realize that's probably only true for people who work at OFAC. So I would suggest you actually look at our FAQs. There's an entire section of the FAQs that's just about banking. And talks about what you can and cannot do with regards to banking. If you're looking at banking broadly, that's the best place to go. If you're looking at banking related to a specific type of activity, such as the physical presence or studying abroad, etc., then I would say you should also look at the questions that relate to that activity, so establishing a physical presence or educational activities. Broadly speaking, there's a lot of room with regard to banking and what you can and cannot do in Cuba, and if you have more specific questions, OFAC's Compliance Division is the best place to talk to if you have questions regarding specific transactions. Their phone number is 1-800-540-6322. Again, it's 1-800-540-6322. That's the Compliance Division. That's only for specific transaction questions. If you have questions, as long as I'm giving phone numbers, regarding obtaining an OFAC-specific license, our Licensing Division's phone number is 202-622-2480. Again, it's 202-622-2480. If you are contemplating applying for an OFAC-specific license, or if you have applied and have questions regarding the status of your license, that's the phone number to call.
Great. Now, this question is fairly specific, but I think it's an interesting opening to a conversation. This is a question about conducting laboratory workshop with chemistry students in Cuba. and it's important for the group going to bring some necessary lab equipment to do their work, the cost of which remains relatively low, under a few $1,000s. The question is, can the equipment be bought and shipped directly from a U.S. manufacturer, or can the equipment be shipped personally and are donated? And since there are chemicals involved, what are the restrictions on either bringing chemicals in to Cuba or bringing them back out, or the results back out into the U.S.?
So there are a few different ways to get to your answers to your questions. I will try and give you all of them in the hopes that somewhere we'll get there. The first is regarding the actual goods going to Cuba. Whether they're shipped personally or in your professional capacity, goods going to Cuba would need a BIS. That's the Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS. They need a BIS authorization. Some of them may be exempt if they're going to Cuban entrepreneurs or certain other types of authorizations, and for that I would say you need to check the BIS website. They've issued a pretty broad general license, which is called a license exception in BIS language. That's called Support for the Cuban People, and they have a lot of different ways for you to get goods to Cuba without needing a BIS license, a specific license. In terms of shipping, in terms of getting the goods there, the only other way I could think of is if it would qualify under OFAC regulations 515.575, which would be humanitarian, and the goods were going to be donated for humanitarian purposes. You would likely still need a BIS authorization even if you're going to donate them, but that may be another way of getting them there. In terms of getting the goods back to the U.S., if they're no longer 100% U.S. origin, there are statutory restrictions imposed by Congress. So I would suggest OFAC just issued FAQs on this because we've got a number of questions the last couple of weeks. And we issue the FAQs within the last 10 days. So check our website because there's very specific FAQs that speak to that issue.
And obviously those things would be also subject to restrictions from CBP and other import areas. Here's a question about grants. Madalena, I'm wondering if you can take this. Can you talk more about grants to U.S. academic institutions for health projects and meetings that might occur in Cuba?
So if you're asking about funding availability by U.S. government agencies, you can always follow the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs. But as Andrea, I'm sure, can attest to, there are a set number of programs that are prescribed. And there is an ongoing small and large grant competition that is being managed by U.S. Embassy Havana at present. If you go to U.S. Embassy Havana's webpage and then search engine, type in Grants Corner, you'll get some more information on what grant opportunities are available.
Great, thank you.
And in the second part of that question, in terms of expanding linkages with institutions, our 100,000 Strong grant, the Innovation Fund grant, may also be an opportunity that you consider applying for.
Great. Back to banking. More questions about money. How is OFAC working to ensure that U.S. banks understand the new regulations so as to allow payments for authorized educational programs to be paid for without any delays? And that follows with the question of how can study abroad programs wire funds to Cuba? So they're kind of wrapped into one there about how we're working with banks.
So OFAC has an entire division, our compliance division, that's dedicated solely to interaction with the banking, both the regulators and the individual financial institutions. We have done a number of targeted outreach events, calls, etc. with the banks. We actually have quarterly calls with them on a number of sanctions issues. Cuba isn't the only one. We oversee approximately over 30 sanctions programs internationally, so this is just one of them. The banks, obviously, surprisingly, they have a very, maybe surprisingly to others on the phone, but from our side, they have a very robust compliance division, a number of folks there who are very familiar with our regulations and understand them. But a bank must make its own risk-based decision regarding whether or not to engage in a particular market. OFAC cannot compel them to process financial transactions. We cannot compel them to engage in the Cuban market. We can only make sure that they understand our regulations. and that they understand what they are and are not authorized to do and what's expected from them in terms of our compliance side. So we do regular outreach with the banks. We answer questions from them on a daily basis. They are very familiar with how to reach us, but we cannot tell them or compel them in any way to engage with Cuba. If they decide they don't want to process any Cuba-related transactions and don't want to engage in the Cuban market, that's their own risk-based decision to make. If it's a question of them not understanding the regulations and a transaction gets held up as a result of that, then they can certainly reach out to OFAC's Compliance Division, which is the number I gave you previously, and we are happy to follow up with a bank regarding specific transactions. If a transaction is processed and for some reason blocked, for example, if it was not otherwise authorized, then an OFAC-specific license would be required to unblock the transaction. In terms of wiring money to and from Cuba, we've issued a lot of different authorizations that relate to this, provided it's for authorized engagement. So I would say to look in our regulations at 515.584 as the best place to start in terms of what you can and cannot do. And again, in our FAQs, there's a whole section regarding banking, and it speaks to wire transfers.
Terrific. Thank you. Here's a question about international students who are studying in the U.S. So these are students from overseas who are studying at our U.S. institutions on a student visa. Would they be able to participate in a short-term study abroad program to Cuba using a general license? So I think that's maybe a mix of programs. This is an international student, maybe a F1 student or a J1 student.
So a non-American.
A non-American who is enrolled in a U.S. institution. Could they enroll in a U.S. institution's short-term program?
So there are a couple of different things to look at, and for part of this answer, I'm going to defer to my State Department colleagues because I think it would depend in part on whether or not their individual visa would even authorize them to travel to and from third countries, or it's specific to the U.S. On our side, once they are in the U.S., they become what's legally called a person subject to U.S. jurisdiction, and as a result of that, they could only go to Cuba if they fell under one of the 12 categories of authorized travel. If their travel to Cuba is for educational activities and would be authorized under one of those 12 categories, then from OFAC's perspective, yes, they could go to Cuba, and then they would also need to ensure that their visa to get back into the U.S. authorized return to the U.S. because they can't come to the U.S. otherwise. And for that, I would again defer to my State Department colleagues.
Yeah, Samantha, I think you answered it perfectly. And Madalena, please chime in if you have additional comments. Just to echo, everything that Samantha said is true. And one of the things to really also consider is that if you're able to participate in a J1, in a program in Cuba, and you are then trying to get back into the United States, you could find yourself in a really difficult position where you would have to then perhaps reapply for another U.S. student visa. So if this is something that you are interested in, I encourage you to please read the regulations beforehand and also check on your visa status and review that very carefully to see how the transition will work if you were to go to Cuba and try to re-enter the U.S.
And I would only add one thing is before traveling, if you do decide to travel to Cuba from the United States, just to ensure that your country has representation in Cuba to assist you if needed.
Terrific. Thank you. That covers most of our questions that we've had, and so we're going to go ahead and ask our presenters if they want to add any few last-minute comments. They have just about a minute or so left before we completely wrap up. Any final words of advice?
I would just say this really represents a great moment for people-to-people exchange with the easing of regulations. We are able to engage on a level that we haven't been able to do in previous years. So I encourage you all to just take advantage of these opportunities and forge ahead.
Madalena, did you want to add anything?
Just an additional point of advice from those mentioned earlier on is that there has been an incredible amount of interest in engaging Cuban students, Cuban universities, et cetera, et cetera. And while this very much so fits within the President's policy, as Andrea mentioned, and I just wanted to add some words of comfort, and it's that the U.S. Embassy or the U.S. government does not need to be does not need to be a player in your conversations with the Cuban entity in Cuba or anywhere for that matter. So please take initiative, take advantage of the networks that exist. The capacity by the U.S. government does not exist to be involved in all of your conversations and your plans going forward, but we certainly encourage you to take advantage of this new era of engagement.
I think just from the Treasury perspective, there are a whole host of ways for U.S. persons to get to Cuba for authorized travel, for educational purposes, for non-commercial research, for study abroad, for a lot of different things, and there are a lot of ways to deal with paying your transactions. There's at least one U.S. bank that's established a correspondent account there so that you can transfer funds. I understand that there have been challenges, as is the case whenever we issue new regulations. There are hiccups because it takes some time for everybody on the private sector side to understand what we've done, and we've now done it 5 times in less than a year and a half. So we apologize. There's definitely growing pains with every new set of regulations, and we know that they're not always the easiest for people to read, which is why we have fact sheets on our website that try to spell it out in layman's terms, and why we have almost 100 FAQs. At least half of those are because they've actually been frequently asked and not just because we were anticipating questions. So please do look at the resources that are already there, and if you can't find the answer to your question, I'm just going to give those 2 phone numbers I gave previously to make sure people have them. If you have questions about a specific license, and that could include official guidance that you would need from OFAC, our licensing division, again, is 202-622-2480, and our compliance division, and again, compliance would be for financial transactions, it would be 1-800-540-6322. I would just reiterate what my colleagues at the State Department have said previously, that U.S. persons are our greatest resource in terms of engaging with the Cuban people, and there are a lot of ways for you to get there and do that legally. So we wish you best of luck with that.
Great. And I just want to thank you. As you can read on the screen, there is a quote from Arlene Johnson, NAFSA's Executive Director and CEO. I want to reiterate NAFSA's commitment to greater engagement with people from around the world. It's been a policy, a priority of the organization for over 50 years now, and it continues to be something that we push for every day. I also want to remind you to subscribe to NAFSA's Cuba Engagement Network. You can find that address at network.nafsa.org. And you can find more information about our advocacy efforts and about our efforts for Cuba engagement in particular on NAFSA's Cuba Engagement Initiatives page, which is also on the NAFSA site. This session has been recorded and will be available on the NAFSA website. Again, I want to thank you and thank all of our presenters for their time today, and I hope that you've enjoyed this government connection. Thank you.